Hi, I just wanted to introduce myself. I was running around yesterday like a little crazy. I don't know, I'm sure y'all planned conferences before. So, I'm Stacy Eastwood. I'm the coordinator for the Office for Veteran and Military Academic Engagement here at ASU. I planned this along with Mariana and Manu, and I wanted to thank them for all the help that they've given me. And I just wanted to do a couple of housekeeping notes. Again, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. It was a really great conference. I learned so much. I'm a veteran. I was in the U.S. Army from 93 to 96. I was deployed to Bosnia for I-4 and all that wonderful stuff. I didn't associate with my veteranhood, my veteran being, until probably 2017. I don't know if anybody else experiences this, but you kind of separate yourself and then you're separated. So this is really great to see everything that everybody's doing for veterans in the veteran community and military connected. And so one thing I did want to share, this is separate from that, I just wanted to say thank you. And then if you're staying at the hotel right over here in the morning, about a block and a half north of the hotel on 5th Street, it's on 5th Street in McKinley, they've got a really great downtown farmers market. Some really great coffee, great local, vendors. They make, all kinds of stuff. So I just wanted to share that with you. If you guys want to stretch your legs in the morning before you get on a flight, they do have that down the street. And then tonight, if you wanted to see more of Ricardo Cate's work, he is going to be teaching a cartoon workshop directly across the street from here at Taylor Place. It's right next to the Chick-fil-A, so if you walk out, it's right there. From 6 to 7:30, he's teaching a cartoon workshop and free dinner. So, if y'all have any questions or y'all need any more parking validated, please come see me. But thank you for being here.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Stacy.
No more? No more. I am the moderator. I was kicked off and now I'm the moderator.
It's you.
Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for staying. I know we're tired and full. Our minds are full of great ideas, hopefully. So I am happy to announce the last panel and I'm gonna get started. I'll be the moderator. I'll keep track roughly. Matt will also be keeping track as well. But our first speaker here, Matt Porter. Please welcome Matt Porter.
All right, howdy y'all, I'm Matt Porter. I am a lecturer in the College of Visual Arts and Design at the University of North Texas. I just wanted to say thank you all for such an engaging conference, and I've learned a lot from all of you. What I'm going to present to you today is theory that has been iterative and is constantly evolving, and something, as theory normally is not finished. But I hope that it does significant work in potentially wrapping up some of the concepts that were presented throughout the conference. So I've entitled my talk, Military Occupational Specialty, Capital, Culture, and Military Labor as an Embodied Practice. So before I begin, I want to preface with a few strategic essentialisms that will clarify the scope of this considerations and terms. This consideration centers on U.S. military and veteran experiences. It's going to assume a male military and veteran subject, and it will hone in on combat and combat adjacency while employing the term service member or soldier as a catachresis. Apologies if you're a sailor, Marine, or airman. I'm going to go with soldier for this. This inquiry starts from an interrogation of labor, seeking to wrestle with the following questions. In what ways might we consider veteran as the post-labor category inform how civilians relate to veterans and understand military activity? In what ways can a critical inquiry into military labor inform how veterans reconcile, negotiate, and articulate their military experiences? And finally, what might a labor perspective reveal about the nuances of veteran and military subjectivity? Since the shift to the all-volunteer force, there has been a widening experiential gap between civilians, military personnel, and veterans. While this shift may work towards jurisdictioning a more professional force, but is this phenomenological lacuna worth the cost? What's more, the language that civilians possess seems to also obscure what a veteran identity is and what military life entails, and thus arises the tension that perhaps civilians can only grasp what military and veteran experience is like as opposed to understanding what it truly is. By and large, the proverbial veteran experience is typically framed as one of transition, moving in, moving through, and moving out of the military. But can a clear concept of veterans be garnered through such a passive and transient framework? As if the veterans in this concept are simply non-playable characters in their own stories. Certainly, this is not to harshly critique Schlossberg's theory, as it does tremendous work in bridging at least some of the perspectival and experiential gap. But rather it is to say that perhaps we ought to frame and reframe the question about what being a military or veteran is or is like, and instead ask the question, what do soldiers do, or its corollary, what have veterans done? Notoriously, Karl Marx has contended that social organization is reducible to labor, and by way of engagement with historic materialism, labor underscores and implies a concrete, action-oriented premise for standpoint formation. By framing military activity as a compensatory labor, it reconceptualizes the verbiage of military work as service, a term that is unfortunately viewed by corporate and universities as something that is non-productive and unvaluable, and centers its complexity by way of its importance, particularly as a producer of surplus capital, which is oftentimes directly felt by civilian society, that sometimes and historically veterans themselves have not always been able to participate in. Finally, in understanding what veterans have done, it provides a baseline for which service providers, employers, and veterans themselves might go about articulating transferable skills, communicating and seeing value potential in veterans, and precise targets of demilitarization upon their homecoming. In short, a labor perspective renegotiates transition theory to a more active place of becoming, doing, relating that can be used to explore both the military stage and the veteran stage rather than inspecting both of them as a part of an entire larger process. So for example, becoming a soldier, doing soldiering, and relating to other troops, or becoming a veteran, doing, as we're trying to figure out now, what veterans do, and then relating to civilians, the military, and other veterans. So I ask you to momentarily consider these questions. What is it that soldiers do? What have veterans done? Or to borrow from Michael Hoffman's presentation yesterday, what precisely are veterans of? Perhaps the first to mind notion is that soldiers do war. That, of course, is the popular trope. So much so that anthropologists such as Hugh Gusterson in a recent SCA article refers to veterans and service members as, quote, violence professionals, a comment that at least in part prompted this present inquiry. Alongside which, Victoria Basham, with a little bit more nuance, posits that, quote, violence is the very condition of military service, and that the ability of states and militaries to wage war is reliant upon the appropriation of bodies for violent labors. As our colleague Todd McDonald illustrated yesterday through a quasi-Lacanian analysis of Waller's seminal work, this pathologizing of veterans as being possessed by violence is nothing new. Contemporaneously, although it's penned by a veteran, the recent Amazon series, The Terminal List, perhaps doesn't help to assuage these tropes. But given that approximately 83% of the military are young men, it is no wonder that these conditions of homosociality and hypermasculinity breed these stereotypes. And although the Bureau of Labor Statistics suggests that veterans find employment in a variety of fields, this tropic mediatization might work to hinder full exploration of career or educational potentials that veterans have, or lead civilian managers to overlook how military experience can be valuable outside of the traditional scope of law enforcement or government, or simply working with things as opposed to people. If we begin to look past the pallor of war, violence, and hypermasculinity that often paints veterans and service members, and that all too often prompts a consideration for killing potential, what might we find? And how might that enhance our understanding of what veteran subjectivity is? Inasmuch as veteran subjectivity involves undergoing a socialization process that shapes and refines one's potential to enact violence, to kill, to destroy, veteran subjectivity might also be underscored by, and perhaps more so, the potential to preserve life and culture, to construct, and to negotiate care. So I'm thinking in context of the Army Corps of Engineers, the idea of relating to your fellow troops, or the National Guard providing aid during times of natural disasters. To the extent that this aspect is too commonly rendered invisible in the consideration of military and veteran value, it frames a large portion of military work in the traditionally feminine. That is, military labor approximates what is referred to as effectively necessary labor, which can be defined as life-sustaining or care work that is oftentimes ascribed as feminine and through its non-productivity rendered invisible. I arrive upon this parallel through reading military labor as paradoxical care work, insofar as it is protective and life-supportive at a distance by maintaining national security and culture, from which Basham might argue that the preservation of culture in the sense of liberalism is ascribed to an enaction of Foucauldian biopower, which would be considered a masculine concept. But if we consider the feminist philosophies, the concept of safeguarding culture is read in the feminine context. And then directly as a result of life reliance commonplace among military personnel, particularly in combat. To provide an illustration from literature, I'll take Sergeant Braxton McCoy's memoir, The Glass Factory, in which he does well to showcase this dynamic. Starting early on, he states that, quote, "It may look like warfighting is doing something egregious, but sometimes the viewer forgets they are seeing about 40 degrees of a 360 environment, and how his mission was, in essence, a protective one." While in the field in Ramadi, after learning of a reported tripwire located in a crowded pavilion and needing to back up to investigate this claim, McCoy details how he opts to take troops from another company rather than using troops from his own team, stating that, quote, "This is a complex bit of logic at play. I knew we needed more help, but I did not want to use my own teammates to provide that help. However, when I was presented with the option of using soldiers from other companies and battalions, I was willing to ask them to come out. It's simply that these soldiers had not been through the hardships with us." And moments later, after tragically being caught in a blast of a suicide bomber and speaking with the combat medic there to aid him, McCoy relates the following conversation. The medic said, "Mac, I've got to go help another Marine. He's worse off than you are, and I'll be back as soon as I can." The medic's voice was stricken with panic, but I felt a deep sense of pride at how well my friend and teammate defeated that trepidation and did his job right. McCoy's story from field to recovery is not only emblematic of his own personal resilience, but his accounting also underscores the intrinsically precarious nature of military work, that is the negotiation of life and death, of which philosopher Achille Mbembe, in the context of taking life, refers to this as the exercise of necro-power, but also the negotiation of whose life to preserve and why, or the medic's negotiation of who gets care, when, and why, and of course the notions of life reliance between the troops across branches. Embedded in and apart from the grueling aspects of the work of war are dimensions of care and what Kalindi Vora articulates as vital energy. This can be clarified as, quote, lifetime and life depletion labor, labor that is done through the precarious positioning of one's own life, either physically or temporally, for the preservation of another's. This can be examined along two axes: soldiers' lifetime in relation to the state and culture, of which the Korea GI Bill actually acknowledges as an aspect in its formation, or the soldier's lifetime in relationship to each other. In the process of war, there are corporeal risks as well, in addition to the time spent in the interest of the state. And at times, this time spent is protective, at times it is unjustified, and at times it is generative of stateside economic growth. At the center of all of this, of course, is the soldier's body. In essence, the work of warfare can partially be reduced to the negotiation of life, whereby the irreducible unit of the work itself is the soldier's life. Life is the apparatus, life is protected, life is taken. The body, the psyche, and the spirit, therefore, are at the center of war work. While life and the body are enmeshed in other fields, the moral, psychic, and physical demands on the soldier's body are not readily commensurable with other fields, not least of which, separating this field from most civilian sectors, is that the very order of the military, as Deleuze and Guattari note, requires the expropriation of the soldier to make him useful for state interest. And this prompts the ethical assessment of the conditions of veteranship, and should or to what extent is the expropriation of one's body a necessary or even acceptable condition of becoming a veteran, a consideration that the aforementioned work of fiction in the terminal list actually deeply engages. Thus, we might take this consideration that military work is frequently precarious, a complex negotiation of life, its preservation, its individualistic reliance, and the taking of it. It is intrinsic in the production of capital and the continuation of the state and natural cultural paradigm, and it is enacted as well as embodied, whereby the action of the work itself interacts with the body doing the work. From this, we might move from the aspect and potentially inevitable phenomenological question of what military and veteran experience is to a framework of what veterans have done, and this could be used as a launch pad to considering what veterans can do as a result. How can their life-supporting or life-saving idiosyncrasies be read as an asset rather than something to be deprogrammed? How can this relational care work might center veterans as uniquely positioned in human-centered fields and not just object-centered ones? Such a labor perspective implicates an unsettling of the stigma and typecasting of veteran capabilities. Secondly, it provides a rational foray into getting to know a veteran, which was presented earlier today by Drs. Krause-Perello and Dr. Ivory. And third, the inversion of the hypermasculine through a lens of the effectively necessary, life-supportive care work might do well to construct a theoretical avenue that will more readily allow us to incorporate female military veterans' experience, perspectives, and values. Thank you.
Program for you for the rest of this panel. So if there are burning questions for Matt at this time, we can take them. But just before I do that, I'll also tell you the purpose of the next iteration of this panel is interactive and discussion based. We're gonna speak briefly, each of us about 5 minutes each, and then we want to really open it up for discussion. That said, if there is a burning question right now for Matthew, happy to entertain that.
So we can ask him questions when you're on.
We would really like that. We would hope.
Let's do that.
Okay. Well, if Matt says so, then that's what we're gonna do. Okay.
My brain needs a break, and I'm sure y'all's do too.
Okay. Is it okay, friends, if is this what we want to have up here? Should I talk about this now first or later?
Yeah.
Okay. So the next portion of this is really, again, to talk about the business of veteran studies, but it also is to offer critiques, considerations, whatever the name of this panel was quite nice.
Considerations and complications.
Thank you, friend. Considerations and complications. That said, because of that, these are some of the questions that we want to pose to you now and throughout. And if you would like, we really encourage you to write your answers to any of these questions on those lovely notebooks that you were given from ASU. The little scrap pieces, if you could just rip off a piece and answer the question and leave them for us for later. We would love to collect those, and you could also talk to us as well. But as they come to you, if you want to answer those questions, great. And now I believe, I'm not sure the order, but seeing the, well, do you know the order?
Yeah, I think with me.
Great. So,
I remember the email vaguely.
Bruce Pencek.
Coin flips.
Yeah.
Bruce. Well, thank you. And just by way of transition, I really liked what Matt did, in part because if you remember some of the early conversations yesterday, it was sort of focusing on veterans, going back to Len Lira's piece. You remember the pull quote from there. He quoted me extensively, if I recall correctly, at some point. Was, veteran studies has to be somehow analogous to black studies, women's studies, or something. What I think Matt's talk, and I really want to read the paper, pointed to is something I'm familiar with from working with a lot of people in science and technology studies, where it's about the relationship. I mentioned in passing that our STS department of Virginia Tech is science and technology in society. And they were there before we were. So there's a connection. Anyway, push this thing out of the side here. We've heard a couple times about the formation of nodes of work in veterans studies, including work I've been in part of at Virginia Tech. Eric Hodges was there at the beginning, and in some respect it's his fault. And the other person who was there is Jim Dubinsky. You've heard him alluded to. He's the absent member of the founding triumvirate of Veterans in Society as an enterprise. He couldn't join us, partially because he busted up a knee, but mostly because he's really busy teaching an NEH Dialogues of Experience of War grant to the Clementi course, which is a fascinating activity to offer free college credit courses to veterans in a public library in a not very affluent part of Roanoke, Virginia. So he's doing very much the kind of work that we've been talking here today, and I really want to acknowledge that and his centrality to the whole Veterans in Society notion of an approach informed by humanities especially, and arts, to this thing that we're calling veterans studies. Well, and of course, my tablet timed out.
See, that's why I wrote mine down.
This same thing happened at the previous conference when I was introducing a Canadian speaker. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Hold him to it. Hold him to it.
Oh, I'm helpless without my notes. Let me get my old notes.
You're burning time, Bruce.
You can have, I'm gonna give you some of my time.
I told you I'm the chronic clueless civilian, but I've also learned something about adapting, improvising, and overcoming. Okay. We've done a lot of stuff over the 10 years or so. We've had several conferences. We've had a virtual symposium about a year and a half ago. Through the Summer Institute that Victoria was so gracious to show the landing page for, so you don't have to take just my word for it, that what does it mean to be a veteran was a fundamental question for us. Offshoots of that led to the Journal of Veteran Studies. Alumni of these various enterprises ended up frequently facilitated by events that very many people have been generously funding to create the Veteran Studies Association. Well, we have an association. Right now, it's very small. Most of the activities in our general sphere have been very personalized, kind of ad hoc, largely providential. And the purpose of the association is essentially to institutionalize the charisma of people like Mariana Grohowski, the Jims, even Eric. And so what we really need to do is do the traditional organizational building stuff. We need people to help. If you don't belong to the association, join. If you've joined, volunteer. If you volunteered a bunch, we have roles in leadership already. And there's a lot of this is in the back of the program. We need to develop policies and practices so it's much easier if we can make the conference a movable feast for the next hosts to learn from what we at Tech have done through several, what Manu and Stacy have learned working sort of at a greater distance from other stakeholders. to make it even better, more informative, to bring in more people than our kind of casual networks. How many of you are aware of the Veteran Studies Conference Group Facebook page? That's more than I expected. Eric created it after the first conference with the goal that it would be a way not only to exchange news about events, calls for papers, and so on, but as a way of sharing ideas. Provocative questions, the kinds of things that Matt's paper really gets us to think about in a subtle and sophisticated way. Well, it's been a lot more narrow. So, how do we organize? We need people to help plan the conferences. We need to think about things for routinizing everyday practices to build the association. Things like networking, outreach. How do we represent veteran studies as a kind of applied field, as a lot of our talk conversations, but also as an intellectual activity in its own right, possibly from a very critical standpoint. How do we represent ourselves to the outside world? How do we represent ourselves to ourselves? This is the business of veteran studies section. What's the value proposition? How do we go from a sort of one-directional, time-delayed communication through conference presentations, through the Journal of Veteran Studies, to a more peer-to-peer, almost real-time communication? Well, we need that infrastructure, and no one is going to build it for us except us. We do have to give thoughts to where's the money come from. It's hard to get the bucks together to run a conference. As I mentioned yesterday, the costs of the journal are absorbed by my employer, so authors don't have to pay page fees or article processing fees. So far as I know, that's going to keep going. But nonetheless, how do we make a better case for what we do? We need someone or some bodies to go out there and help raise the bucks. Finally, how do we recognize our own good works? How do we recognize contributions to veteran studies, no matter who does them? How do we recognize contributions to the good of VSA? We need people with ideas to do it, and we need different people with ideas than the half dozen or so core people who've known each other for years, because we're not representative of you. We're not necessarily representative of all the other people who are doing veterans studies related work. You have ties out there that we don't have.
And we're tired.
Thank you for the cue. I'll sit down now then.
Is it me? Oh, well, I don't have much. So I'm yeah, don't time me. So I'm on the executive board of the Veteran Studies Association, and my role right now is the treasurer. And I see my responsibilities as receiving your dollars and working hard with the executive board to create value with those dollars. And then making sure we're using those things effectively. So I have some ideas. We instituted one of those ideas this year, which was the travel grants. And I'm happy to say that there are 8 people out there who received travel grants. And we will be coming for you for your ideas and thoughts, because we then need to turn that around into value, into labor, which is words on a page somewhere. So start writing down your notes. I think first of all, we are solvent. That's important to know. Thanks to you, we have enough money to keep ourselves going and run a conference every 2 years right now. Maybe that needs to be every year, I don't know. We think there's some other places where we can use this value, use the money to create value for you. Research support, some sort of granting for people who are doing veteran studies research. Conference support, clearly. Awards, maybe awards of a monetary value for best paper, maybe some sort of institutional type award. I do tell you, we need to be very cognizant about the labor we ask people to do and paying people to do that labor. So that's the professional labor of running the journal, which is not easy. Editing articles, which is not easy. And that type of work. And we have some ideas. In fact, just in this conference, a couple of people came and talked to me about institutional memberships rather than individual memberships. We hadn't considered it because we're just a bunch of people sitting around a Zoom talking, right? That's a great idea, but we also want to make sure we give value to the institution if we're going to create an institutional memberships level. And I will just say, we need all the help we can get, so come help. And I know that's just too broad, so we probably need to tell you how to help, but we're working on that. Right, is that all? I think that's all I was gonna talk about.
Well, and one other point about that, of course, is we are asking, but there is this opportunity, particularly you who are in an academic career track at the entry level. As we create task force to create policies and develop a committee structure and fill the committee structure, all of those are paths to leadership. Those are the kinds of things that do count at least somewhat in promotion and tenure decisions, may look good in various kinds of hiring decisions. So at least there's some sort of things you can get beyond the general sense of goodwill and contributing to a good cause.
So I've just got a few thoughts I'm going to throw out there. I'm not going to talk that long, and then we can open it up for a discussion. Considerations and complications. So thinking about veteran studies as being a resilient field, I think we're pretty damn resilient. We've been around for 10 years now, and I think we should pat ourselves on the back for what we've accomplished. In that 10 years, we've had 7 events under the name Veterans in Society. We planned a conference in St. Louis that unfortunately COVID derailed, but we rebounded with the Conversations series. We've published 253 scholarly articles in JVS in the past 6 years. We've had numerous federally funded projects that we've undertaken, and I think we've built a great community of scholars. So, and we've done that in the face of some adversity with COVID. So that's one thing to think about. I think we should pat ourselves on the back for being resilient. That doesn't mean that we can't make things better. Obviously we can, but I think we've done a lot in 10 years. The second consideration or question I wanted to ask is, how are we measuring our impact? It's easy to, the scholarly impact is easier to measure, right? We can look at the amount of articles that have been put out, citations, things like that, but the subtitle of the first conference was Changing the Discourse. And have we been effective at doing that? Yeah, I don't know, right? Have we humanized the discourse? Are we preaching to the choir, essentially, I guess is the question, right? Are we actually making those differences in society outside of our little community that are contributing to, bridging the gap between veterans and civilians, which is why I got into this work to begin with. As Bruce said, there's a lot of work that's still left to be done, obviously, right? With the institutionalizing, with some of the stuff that Lynn Lira was talking about in his piece about, creating intellectual frameworks for veteran studies. But of course, that's a double-edged sword, right? Because as we've heard over the past couple of days, there are a lot of different disciplines looking at a lot of different things with a lot of different intellectual frameworks and a lot of different methodologies. So, we have to be careful about homogenizing some of that stuff because we don't want to lose those different approaches and different perspectives. So thinking about how do we actually create a coherent field given the various number of disciplines and methodologies that we have. A complication, perhaps, is we're in a changing landscape. politically and looking at veterans themselves, right, with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan being over, the fact that we're losing 500 Vietnam veterans a day. So the population is changing in a lot of ways, and how, how are we going to adjust to that as a society? Political polarization, is that going to be a complication that are veterans going to become a polarized issue? And how do we respond to that in a society that we see is becoming more and more polarized every day? And then I guess the last complication that I'll throw out there is the changing nature of higher education itself. What does that say about our project? How are we going to respond to that given the way that higher education is changing? There's this demographic cliff that people keep talking about, fewer students coming into higher education, the move into more online education. How are all these macro factors going to affect what we're doing as a group? So I just throw those out for food for thought.
I'm not going to talk long, but I just want to talk a little bit about the goals of the VSA. We founded VSA in 2019 as a nonprofit, again, to do the goal of VSA, which is on our website. It's not a pretty website, I've been told, but that's what we got when you're building it by yourself. The goals of VSA is the promotion and publication of rigorous scholarship about critical issues shaping veterans' experiences in any country and any historical era to enhance public understanding, teaching, service, and advocacy. So that remains our goal. We just actually updated our mission statement to be more articulate, concise, and inclusive. And how do we, and as inaugural president, thanks Bruce for that term, as inaugural president, again, what are our goals? Most importantly to me, why I do this work is the sustainability and development of the field. I really want to see this outlive me, but in order to do that, in order to have sustainability and further development, as my colleagues have been talking about, we desperately need assistance to lift and help support these efforts. And as Matt was talking about, the feminization of labor and the invisibility of it, it does fall on a few heads at this point, and it isn't as privileged and prized as other forms of scholarly endeavors, but I appreciate the fact that VSA exists, that as Jim did not mention, but we were able to actually compensate, we were finally able to compensate the work of the JVS editor at this point only, but in a small stipend, but hopefully we can offer more compensation to associate editors, to copy editors. We need to pay for this labor in order for it to be continued and sustainable and to continue to develop. So those are really my goals, is sustainability and development. And again, we really need your help. We have the call for elections coming up here, and we also want your help with your ideas of how to sustain and develop the field. So let's open it up for discussion. And yeah, I'm glad if you love. So thoughts, considerations.
So everybody can hear you in the
Cool.
room.
Yep.
And also this,
Questions for Matt? Questions for the VSA? Thoughts?
I have a question for Matt before we go on.
Let's do it.
Matt, what's the language you showed about them, and now it's removed by a few minutes.
action.
The violence, the management, the institution of violence as the core of veteranness or militariness, and I'm getting that wrong. What's the role or what's the responsibility of actually the Department of Defense in that? Because if you were to go to any Department of Defense, any branch website, they're going to talk to you about the profession of arms. And then they're going to define the profession of arms in some way, like the management of violence on behalf of society, or something in that way. And so when we bring in brand-new privates, we teach them that they are professionals, and their profession is to do violence on behalf of the society. So I don't know the society told the DoD to do that. I think they chose that because that feels really good. I mean, we can go back to Huntington or Janowitz on that, but we could tell them to stop doing that, right? Stop using that type of language in some way with policy or something. Is that a?
What would you change it to, though?
I don't know what we would change it to, but
Maybe Matt knows.
yeah, maybe Matt knows.
Maybe Matt knows what you call it.
Yeah, no, I'm not 100% sure. Like, when it comes to nomenclature, that's a very difficult thing. So, like you just mentioned, Jim, it's that function of how do you articulate what that job and what that work is, and it comes from a really long historical kind of genealogy of, you know, if you're conscripted or if you're a mercenary under the feudal system, basically you're doing combat and fighting as your chosen job because you had complete control over your own faculties and you were using your body and trading your labor in fighting and conflict and violence and everything of that nature because the mercenaries chose to. But as Deleuze and Guattari note in On Nomadology, they think about that in concept of the state and how in order for a state functioning military to occur, they have to delimit the individualization of a soldier's ability to freely trade his own labor. Otherwise, they're not, you can't make a cohesive fight because everyone is on their own terms and, you know, fighting because they want to, as opposed to in the interest of a larger government body. So I don't know. It's essentially an experiment in the liberal project, but I don't know if there's a good way to market that, especially and make it palatable to civilians as well as, you know.
I mean, but doesn't the all-volunteer force call that into question in a way? I mean, aren't people freely volunteering to serve in the military, so?
But
I
under
mean-
a state apparatus,
What-
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
so that apparatus is what keeps you from being a mercenary. Oh,
Yeah,
But a soldier doesn't have free reign to. A soldier doesn't have a right of self-defense, right? If you're on a soldier does not have a right of self. If you are in an ambush line, if you are in an ambush line and you get scared, you can't shoot until your lieutenant says shoot.
That's not true.
That is true, because then you busted the ambush. No, you get orders, so you don't have an inherent right of self-defense.
You're talking about one military situation and scenario. If you're in combat, your lieutenant's not running around telling you to shoot. Your lieutenant's doing their job, but you know the rules of engagement. And
So you
self-defense is
inherently
definitely part
don't,
of that.
but you, and maybe we're splitting hairs, but you have to engage in your self-defense in accordance with the rules that have been created for you. And so the struggle is, I think you're right, in this case, you have traded or you have become an element of the state. Your body becomes the work of the state, your corpus or whatever you use the language, the cool language you use, which I need to find. And so I struggle with that, and I wonder, but I don't know a better answer.
Well,
In
it
a-
would
in an all
seem to be an answer to your first part of that question, Jim. I think Matt was suggesting sort of the preponderance of the evidence
Yeah.
is that until under fairly circumscribed conditions, at least in nation-state versus nation-state, the Westphalian system of war, violence is a possibility, but it's a small part of what you do.
Right.
And that's been emphasized a number of times here. And yesterday, someone referred to veterans in the Cold War. Dubinsky commanded batteries with tactical nukes on the German border. He didn't need them. He identifies himself, though, as a veteran. My brother was in the Air Force in 1969. I had a couple cousins in theater closer to hostilities. My brother turned 70 before he identified himself as a veteran. So again, part of the sense of what we've been trying to do is problematizing what is the essence. And I think I think Matt was really raising something in the sense of sort of the negative space of the warrior ethos as defining the relation, at least to state and the interpersonal relationships.
Now let's do the business. That was great.
So how do we move this enterprise forward?
Yeah.
Is the question.
Yes.
So what should we talk about at the next conference?
Yeah.
Dan has a hand up. Yep. I can't believe you're doing my job. Thank you.
Well, I think what y'all are saying is kind of a perfect segue into the mission statement. Because as a veteran, I did personnel records. I served in Alaska. I considered it overseas, but it wasn't overseas. It was cold. And we were training Marines, crazy hats, went out and marched around in their underwear. And it's cold. For Cold War, because we thought we were born in the USSR. Yeah, I'm old. I'm gonna die. How many?
500 a day. You're
536
tomorrow.
a day.
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
so,
Tomorrow. You're dead.
but the point is, to me, there's a mission statement or something, or part of what you're talking about, objectives.
Yeah.
How do we take veteran studies and keep it positive? There are so
Yeah.
many, Mariana brought it up yesterday when the suicide rates, and it was presented in a positive way. The hero thing, let's present it in a positive way. Keep the messages positive about veterans, because we're doing a job that nobody else wants to do.
Yeah. Yep. Yes.
By the way, thank you, Rashad.
Yes, thank you, Rashad. He volunteered. I didn't tell you to do it, but thank you. You're doing a great job. Thank you.
Just, yeah, whatever.
No.
Oh, what? No, did I want
Just,
to?
Ben, whatever you wanted to say, man. It's gonna be
No,
perfect.
I mean, I guess the only thing that I would say, I mean, you're thinking about, rather than presenting it from a deficit perspective, presenting the strengths that veterans bring to society. That's the idea. I mean, I think that's a great model, unless we find a case where there are some negative aspects to military service. I think we have to be honest about those, and I think we have to present that information. But I certainly don't think it should be just a deficit-based model. That's just
Which is what you
my
wrote
opinion.
about. You wrote about that too.
But again, part of the reason that our mission statement says of any side in any era is precisely to recognize those times when veterans under certain circumstances, however the veterans are defined, are potentially a problem or potentially an asset. This is not simply about living or recently living U.S. veterans and U.S. society.
So,
I mean,
Ben wanted to say something.
yeah.
I was just gonna say, it's not an either or, right?
Right.
It's a both and. It's always a both and. And, you know, we can't look at soldiers as a care-giving force without understanding that they're also a violent force, right? Because they can't be a care force without the violence, right? Like, what are they caring for, right? But the actual, so I come from like a critical military studies background, and it's always about problematizing, right? Like, I don't, when I'm working as a advocate in a veteran space, right, I am bringing the you know, additive. What are they bringing to this space that adds to our community? But when I'm thinking about militarism, when I'm thinking about war, right, I'm often thinking way more about the negative impacts, right, on society, on veterans, on soldiers, right? And I think that we have to be critical, because if we just, you know, try to whitewash all the violence and the negative things, then we just look like we're, you know, props of the DOD.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, last year in JBS, I wrote an article on the veterans who participated in the Capitol riots. And I mean, I think you have to present, it's not because I don't care about veterans or I want veterans to be perceived as violent extremists, but because I think it speaks to an important aspect of the military experience and the veteran experience. So I think you have to present that kind of information.
Right, and to piggyback on that, when I mentioned that term violence professionals, it actually came out of an article that was written for Society for Cultural Anthropology on the Capitol riots. So it's kind of that interesting how they're using that as a foreway to kind of think about radicalism in the ilk of kind of what Waller was doing way back in the night. We see these tropes reoccurring, and we have to assess to what extent those are true and handle them for what they are and what they're true, but also figure out a nuanced way to engage those negativities, but also see, okay, so, but what are the silver linings to having that experience and having that type of mindset that actually isn't so non-useful in standard polite society as well. So it's definitely a both and kind of situation.
So I've got two questions, one for Matt and one for the other half of the panel.
Yes. You said it.
So for Matt,
Our COVID wall.
I really appreciate the piece that you wrote for JVS. I was able to cite that in my proposal for my dissertation. It was very helpful. The question I have based on your presentation is, you talk about service. And one of the trends that I've seen but not investigated is veterans of this newest generation are not flocking to the VFW halls, American Legion halls, right? But they are joining Team Red, White, and Blue, Team Rubicon, Mission Continued. They're being Tillman scholars, those kinds of things. They're all organizations founded around a purpose and some service in some sense. And I'm curious if your research has veered into that, or you have some ideas about how those two things might tie in, especially because you talk about the future. And then I'll let you think about that while I ask everybody else. The other thing, the more practical thing for us as a collective, are there current mechanisms or are there plans for some mechanisms for increased collaboration among the membership between conferences?
Well, since I sort of raised that question, currently it's a lot of personal networks. Again, there is the Facebook group that we started pretty much as an opportunity for people at that first conference to communicate with each other, but it's been up forever. What we, in the sort of two stages of contributions to organization building, first, let's have folks who might be the communication scholars, whether it's the critical kind of communication scholarship or the pragmatic, how do you do stuff, because we need both, to say, well, what is a given resources, given current technologies, what are the ways that member-to-member communication can work, not necessarily in a public forum, recognizing, though, that a lot of associations have, my whatever. I'm a member of the American Political Science Association. I get my APSA pieces and my whatever the American Historical Association's one are. Those are really expensive from an organizational standpoint to host, but there may be sort of off-the-shelf technologies where if we have a mechanism for members to identify themselves with minimal intrusion upon your privacy, and that's the difficulty with the off-the-shelf technologies, to do that and sort of make it a members-only benefit. I know that such things are done. I don't know how to do it, but
We've done a couple of these things, but again, we encourage you, if you're interested in, we pass the torch to you. We've had work in progress Zoom groups that we've we surveyed the membership with no one answering. How would you like us to serve you? What opportunities would you like to see? And one, people have to answer the survey so we can provide the benefits for them to enhance collaborations amongst members. One, you need to participate in the survey. Two, we hosted these work in progress groups. Very few people came, but that's hard, right? It's hard to meet on Zoom and to do these things. But if you have ideas for these things, as a member, we would like to pass the torch to you to start hosting those things. To email any of us, and we will say, okay, here's the rest of the membership. Would you like to host the next work in progress group? We wanted to do a book club. Would you like to lead the book club? We want to do these things, but as we've said here, we cannot do them alone. And therefore, great idea. Would you like to do that? And Matt, do you want to answer that question before you forget the question, or?
No, thank you for your question. I think, I don't know, what's your field? Sorry. Social work. I'm not going to assume that you're not, but if you're familiar with the work of Spivak on post-structuralism, she articulates the importance that the language that we use to describe and talk about things has immense force. So when we think about service and we continue that use of service, that does have historical embeddedness. So historically, it was an obligation. You did it because you were obligated to do so as a citizen. But now, if we're thinking in terms of an all-volunteer force, it is a compensatory form of labor exchange, meaning that people in the militaries aren't just kind of randomly picked to go do a task. They're actually experts in a particular type of work. And it's important that we understand what that particular expertise is. So a couple of people mentioned, quite a few people actually mentioned, trying to figure out how civilians can think about veterans' value. Well, first you have to understand what they're experts in. And when we sometimes just put the paintbrush of service in it, it's like, well, you're not really an expert in anything. You're just kind of volunteering your time. But what is happening in that time that's giving you a formative epistemic value to what that experience has given you that you can now offer somewhere else. So thinking about it, not in the, and I think, again, might be splitting hairs, but it's the word that sometimes can be a roadblock to understanding what's really going on. I hope that somewhat clarifies. I don't know if that's the right approach, but perhaps that's a way to conceptualize it.
Okay, and then.
Sorry, any responses to that before I ask my question?
I was going to. I guess the thing that occurred to me was, apparently I don't talk loud enough yet. Thank you.
It's a skill. Certainly the reason they let me be an officer. The thing that occurred to me was that I had heard anecdotally the same thing about things like Habitat for Humanity and volunteerism, but also one of my committee members works at the VA in Ann Arbor, and she said something that I found really fascinating. She said one of the reasons she liked doing qualitative research at the VA is because veterans volunteer for medical research at a far higher rate than civilians do. So as long as she did her work through the VA, she was guaranteed to get much higher participation, or get that participation much more quickly than she would have otherwise. And yeah, maybe that doesn't seem like particular expertise lining up for medical. But the idea of obligation seems really important there, that there is something about a felt obligation, perhaps, that arises during service that continues to need an outlet after service, some place where you can continue to feel that same sense of fulfillment of having done your duty.
Right. No, and I think it was Dr. White yesterday mentioned that concept of servant leadership, and you know, within the span of 12 hours, I wasn't able to really think that through. But I think you do have a point that there is that element there as well. So.
And quicker, man.
I'll get this right. So first of all, I want to apologize to Jim for getting distracted by your use of the term self-defense.
Yeah.
That has a specific meaning, as you mentioned you have military service, and that in the context of rules of engagement, as long as I was in the service, almost 25 years, up until last summer, the standing rules of engagement included the inherent right to self-defense. So that was my distraction. My apologies for dampening the dialogue, and I see where you were trying to go with that now. I would offer that when we raise our hand and give our oath to support and defend the Constitution, we're accepting that we'll follow the lawful orders of those appointed over us. And we're doing that voluntarily, and with that comes some risk, varying degrees of risk by the situation and part of the profession. But ultimately, it's unlimited because we've sworn to support and defend the Constitution with our lives. So my apologies for the lack of courtesy for the dialogue there. I would offer to Matt, and I forget where I first heard this, but in the absence of the state commissioning me and others to serve in the military, I would essentially be a mass murderer or accessory to mass murder without that state sanction. Or a conspirator to commit mass murder as a military strategist. So I think the distinction of what our obligations are when we swear that oath is what makes a veteran or doesn't make a veteran. And I'm oversimplifying, I think, what you were very eloquently and well-researched presentation trying to show, but that's how I would describe the essence of it. So, thank you.
Can I do a quick response to that, even though it's like, so you're touching on what I see as and I mentioned in mine that the two of the potential poles of our veteran writers right now, the Scranton and the Clydes. If you read Roy Scranton, I'm not sure he accepts the absolution for the murder, right? He's all mixed up in it, just like everyone, and he's still
would be
right. And yeah, it's a very interesting way to think about this, right? And he has just kind of said, "Shit, I did that," right? And he's struggling with it, while others will accept the absolution of the state and move on and present themselves in the best possible light in the next step. But that's interesting. Yeah.
legal absolution, right, but not moral
But not-
absolution.
right, yeah.
That's
Yeah,
the difference.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would also say that the other question there is when you're talking about moral obligation, is on the civilians. And the military and the members of the military who do engage in that violence are potentially instruments of a policy that civilians have a hand in as well. And responsibility.
We the people.
On our system, they're at the top.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Oh, boy. We got, he's jumping up.
So I
Wiley's excited.
Yeah, he's excited.
work for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force in his Strategic Studies group. His name is Tom Earhart. He's a military strategist, PhD, from Johns Hopkins SAIS. And he would say the cost of war is not just measured in blood and treasure, but there's a social cost. There's a third component to that. The thing that bothers me the most about thank you for your service is it's a throwaway. It's a mic drop comment in most cases. There's no critical thought. There is often not critical thought in what the state is sanctioning us to do. Should we have spent 20 years in Afghanistan? Is that cost worth it? We haven't felt that cost as a society, and everybody feels good as the pendulum has swung from post-Vietnam, where my dad got spit on, to today, everybody's thanked. And
We know where you stand. We need to do business. Are we done?
So what should we, yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just gonna, I mean, I know it's the end of a long 2 days, but does anybody have any thoughts at all about these 5 or 4 or 5 questions we put up? Yeah, Ben.
I think I'm good, Rashad. Thank you. There's one thing I'm good at.
Oh, let him get his steps in. I'm just kidding.
I have 2 ideas that came to mind. Really, I think that the idea of veterans is maybe counterintuitive to studying folks who are choosing to join the military. But I look at it as a point of perhaps intervention instead of prevention later down the line, if you would think about it in that lighting or in that framework, that there's got to be evidence, data that we can pull from the type of people who, one, choose to join the military during a time of war, and maybe even choose to join into one of the combat MOSs that are out there available, and how those specific groups end up transitioning, end up landing in society. And really the second one I had is maybe a little bit more contentious, but as someone who's worked side by side and has had many peers who have gone into the civilian contracting world, I would love to see more data about folks who either forego military service in favor of being paid those 6-figure salaries, or who choose to leave the military and instead join those forces who are out there doing a very different mission. I think that both those areas would be fantastic to study and could add a more well-rounded look at the entire military and, of course, how veterans land out there.
Thank you.
One thing to add to that line of thinking. One thing to add to that line of thinking is, as the technology of warfare is changing, the experience of the veteran is also changing.
Yeah.
As an intelligence officer, I spent some number of years working with and leading people who were leaving their houses every morning to go to work, to mentally, if not physically, be in a war zone here in the United States. With video and audio of intimate combat situations that they were integral to the outcome of without actually being in danger themselves. And then at the end of their mission, they go back home and have to take care of the family, mow the lawn, and pet the dog if they have one. So that technology evolution is also changing the veteran experience. So that would be an interesting topic to me.
There's that sheet.
Hi, I'm going back to the selling of veteran studies again. I think a voice that may be missing is like high schoolers. Do they want to go to college for this? Is it something that they would even consider as a high school student? You don't know what you want to do? Is it something that, oh yeah, I'm curious in that, I don't know what that is. Obviously, a lot of those students might go directly into the military and not, come back to university later, but I think that'd be an interesting voice to hear from.
I see you.
We call it a voluntary force, but for some people in poor neighborhoods, it's not really voluntary. It's kind of something they need to do and they have to do to be able to go to college. And so we call it voluntary, but it's really monetized. Because when the argument came up recently about free college, the biggest thing I heard was, well, what's the military going to do? How are they going to get forced? How are they going to get people there? So it's not necessarily voluntary anymore. It never really has been.
Yes.
As long as you have a GI Bill that's getting people out of their neighborhoods and into jobs, it's necessary, and it's like they have to be there. So we have to research that also, because like if you're talking about somebody in high school, that's their only choice. If they're going to get out of the neighborhood that they're in, I have a 13-year-old daughter, and her friend, that's how she's getting out of her house. I mean, and she's 13 and she's already thinking of it. So,
Can I just comment briefly? It's a really good point, and I wonder if it's valuable to consider, is that type of work veteran studies, or is that something that's more for armed forces and society, or a military studies? And is there, and I know it's a vague line, but is there a line between military studies and veteran studies?
Yep.
I don't know.
if it leads to trauma in the veteran experience, you can draw a line
Yeah.
from the necessity to join the military to get out into suffering trauma perhaps later.
Or making contribution.
Yeah,
But I think the notion of voice is an interesting one that you raised, because one could certainly say from a veteran studies standpoint that what veterans represent about military service is competing with what active duty personnel, their families would say, and also, of course, multiple media and literary representations. So it's veterans in the context of other message bearers, I think would be a neat way to raise that question.
Let's have one more comment. Oh, okay, two. We had one here, and then let's have another one, and then, okay.
I definitely agree with, about, it's not a voluntary force, it's a recruited force in trying to get out, but also, I forget where I was reading this about a large, more and more recruits are coming from families of military.
Right.
And so we're having this constant feedback loop of military become a veteran and then raise a kid who does the same thing. So it's, I mean, I'm not comfortable with the, people have been calling it a caste, and that's just really weird. But I mean, it's one reason I'm studying veteran culture, because this is the culture that's going to be part of the
next
recruits.
military.
But I did have an answer to that last question about that conference idea. Is already started hearing about ideas about a war memorials for these wars from the past 20 years, and we need to remember that the Vietnam Memorial is technically the Vietnam War Veterans Memorial.
Right.
So a conference around that idea. What would a memorial look like? Who counts as the veteran? What were the wars? Do we have a separate one for Iraq and Afghanistan? I mean, all these, how many ever questions we can add to that.
Sweet.
I guess my thought was, I'm good. Thank you. Teach you out of your steps, sorry. That last question, is there a difference between veteran studies and armed forces and society? Probably, but one thing that seemed to come up, especially in some of the more contentious parts of this discussion earlier, is that there are aspects of military experience which might be essential to understanding veteran experience, and identifying those, and without essentializing, figuring out what's essential. To wit, one of the big questions on the table today seemed to be, is understanding violence essential to understanding veterans? That seems to me like something that's worth hashing out. Maybe not for all parts of veteran studies. There are parts of veteran studies which seem to be much more distinctly focused on, especially focused on care of veterans. Nevertheless, I suspect that every field at some level has to come to terms with what they can and cannot do and don't understand about what those veterans experienced in the military. Armed forces and society strikes me as a more theoretical field, and veteran studies a field that's more about individuals and where lived experience happens, where rubber meets the road.
I'm with you 100%. But one of the reasons why I raised that, not just to say I think there's a line, is the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces Society is a well-developed organization.
You're the best.
That is has the structures that we might want to model, and also if you go to their conferences, there's like this little thing about veterans in the corner of it. Like maybe they want to grow that, and there's a place to merge or help or do something. And I would bet Society of History might be interested, or something else might be interested, or maybe we're okay just kind of being 100 people in a room, really happy and knowing each other. And I don't know.
Well, again, to add to Jim's point, we got onto a biennial schedule with the conferences so that we did not conflict with the meeting of Ergomos, the European Military Sociology group, which for several years had an active veterans and society section. They seem to have petered out. But nonetheless, we were trying to respect, with our aspirations to take an internationalized view of things, that people could not go to our conference, typically in Roanoke, versus going to
Paris,
Lisbon, Rio, I think was another one. So,
I do.
yeah, let's
get one more.
Yep, last one. Yep.
one of our alumni.
Seems dangerous.
Possibly I don't need it. I think everyone can hear me. Anyway, as we've been talking here, people keep coming back eventually to the identity of
There's some online still, so.
What counts as a veteran or not. And I feel like I've thought a lot about those. I'm not sure those issues, I'm not sure I've come to definitive conclusions, but I'd like to make a few points and move into it with a couple of bio data points. In 2012, I attended a lecture by Cynthia Enloe. She's a gender studies scholar who works on militarization, war, and women, and the effect of war on people who aren't military. And I've read a lot of books about World War II and Vietnam and Afghanistan and the Iraq War. And I was listening to her speak. A kind of kaleidoscopic shift occurred in me. And all this knowledge that I'd already had, I found, becoming restructured into a different set of priorities. And of course, I'd always seen women in war. I mean, you see them in the pictures, but they'd never been any real, they've been conceptually invisible to me. Let me say that, all right? In 2016, I think I had a similar kind of experience at that NEH seminar at Virginia Tech. And for a couple of days, we're studying Civil War veterans. And at first, I hadn't been much interested in that. I didn't see much promise in that. And as we're going through this, I'm looking at, first of all, how many people are conscripted to fight the war, and then after the war, 600,000 pensions are created by this relatively tiny state. And what interested me is suddenly how this shapes the entire state of this modern nation in formation. I went from that not to more interest in American veterans and so forth, but to Europe, where these mass conscript armies were created, creating identities that went across class line and so forth, and then after the war across national boundaries as well, as veterans unified to prevent future wars and also to share information about policies and so policy and the like, creating new identity groups. In the 2018 conference that we had, I presented a paper on German veterans, which was focused on how the politics, especially the violent politics of the post-war era, was filtered through a veteran identity. And then in World War II, how that filter was effectively destroyed by the fact that virtually everyone had some kind of combat experience at the end of the war. Hope I'm not summarizing that too superficially. For the 2020 conference, I was going to I proposed a paper which was accepted on the formation of the Indian Army and the Indian subcontinent by the British, and how actually the formation of that army ended up creating the conditions that would make India ungovernable for the British. And this is what I was thinking about in terms of veteran studies. It just opened up all of these other paths for me because I hadn't had this kind of focus or this lens to look through all of this material. So I was thinking of veteran studies more on the line of, say, Asian studies, all right? You don't have to be Asian to study Asian studies. Everyone recognizes how important it is, especially in the field of political science. It's a knowledge field. So that's what you're studying, and it's not modeled on a single discipline. There's a locus that people working in language and in economics and in sociology and in history and literature, they're all addressing that single locus. It makes the field coherent, right? So if we get to veteran studies, we maybe have something like that, but then the issue of what's a veteran comes up. Who counts as a veteran? Well, from my thinking, what makes a veteran is not combat experience or experience of war or things like that. But as what Jim mentioned, the way in which the state takes all of these myriad bodies and instrumentalizes them so that they can come together under central command to fight or do whatever it needs to be done. And so veterans are veterans even if they've never been in a war. And also, people who may have been in a war aren't necessarily veterans. I noticed that in a lot of veteran studies work, we see people referring to classical literature and models, like the story of Odysseus returning home, or the wounded Philoctetes abandoned by his friends and so forth. And those are very productive in helping, I think, veterans process whatever they've been through when they're transiting back to civilian life. But I don't think of those characters as veterans. They're warriors. That's something entirely different. They haven't learned, their bodies haven't been trained in the same way. They're not trained in central command in the same way, at least not in the Homeric versions of that. This brings me to some of these questions that we see here. I guess I would like to see veteran studies keep doing what it's doing, but also expand into some of these other areas, comparative, cultural veteran studies, sort of. But
thank you.
You have to have people who are interested in that and wanting to do that. I'm not sure that we have that base right now, but at least I would like to toss that out there as a possibility.
Thank you.
Well, I better stop.
Close this out, Mayor. That was a good wrap up.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. So I don't want to be the one that says goodnight, but
We're not done yet.
We're not done
So
yet.
you
To
can't
be
say
continued.
goodnight, Mayor, so you need to sit back down. Now,
Okay,
actually,
great.
Mayor, why don't you come up over here? Because at the end of this year, Mayor will step down as the president of the Veteran Studies Association, the founding, inaugural
Yes.
Veteran Studies Association. So we just have a small gift for Mayor. This award is presented to Mariana Grohowski, founding president of the Veteran Studies Association, in recognition of her immense contributions to the advancement of veteran studies and the association.